So, hello again, ladies. We're going to be looking at the course companion 5A. This is the second PowerPoint that we've looked at, and this is to do with objectives of firms. So, we looked previously at market structure and the different types of market structure that you're going to need to understand, from perfect competition to monopolistic competition to oligopoly and monopoly, and to some degree, the strategy and the market structure that is dictated to, or that organisations sort of slot into, will be somewhat dictated by the objectives that they set for themselves. And there are 4 or 5 examples that you'll need to understand and appreciate. There are more objectives for firms, and one of the things I want you to give some thought to before having gone through this in any huge amount of detail is the principle of what sort of objectives do you think firms might have. So I suggest you spend a bit of time putting a spidergram together of the different types of objectives that firms may have, and spend a few minutes doing that. You might need to do a little bit of research on that, and then we can discuss that after you've completed that process. Okay, so suggest you stop the presentation here for a moment and do a little bit of research into different types of objectives for firms. Okay, so let's take a look at what you're going to need to know for this particular section, and then we'll look at some different types of objective that businesses might have and the reasons for them, and also the fact that each one has a specific diagram. If you had to demonstrate that a firm that was had an objective of profit maximization, there is a diagram that you can use to illustrate that, and a number of these other examples also have diagrams that illustrate slightly different scenarios, showing in each case that they are being driven by slightly different reasons, I suppose, or objectives that they're trying to achieve. So let's take a look at what you're going to need to know. So this again is straight from the specification. So some models that comprise the traditional theory of the firm are based on a number of assumptions that firms aim to maximize profits. Okay, so more often than not, the profit maximization objective is probably going to be the most frequent one that you will use. So understanding that and the reasons why and where businesses choose to produce, at the levels at which they choose to produce, and the levels at which they choose to sell their goods and services, that clearly is going to be driven by the profit maximization principle. And thinking about production costs and revenue, like we looked at in CC4, one of the really important principles is to remember the profit maximizing rule, which we'll look at in a minute. And that is effectively that the point at which a profit maximizing business will want to operate is where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Now, we've sort of already proved that in terms of the reasons why you might want to do that if you're a profit maximizing company and that's your objective, but we'll look at that in a bit more detail as we go. We're also going to need to know, particularly when we're looking at different types of objective, the reasons for and the consequences of a divorce of ownership from control. Now, that means that in some instances, particularly in larger organisations where the owner may not necessarily have complete control over the day-to-day operations of an organisation, so they might have handed that to a management team of some description. And as a result of that, the owner's view and the manager's view of that business and the way in which they operate might differ somewhat. So that's something to bear in mind, and we'll look at that again in a little bit more detail. Obviously, firms don't just have profit maximization as the only objective. It's probably the most common. However, there are other objectives that we need to consider and need to be aware of. We also need to understand the satisficing principle. That's not spelt wrong, that is actually spelt correctly. The satisficing principle, which sort of relates back to this consequence of a divorce between ownership and control. So that's something that we'll look at also in a bit more detail. What are you going to need to be able to understand then, as far as this part of the syllabus is concerned? Should be able to recognise that firms have a range of possible objectives, including survival, growth, quality, maximising their sales revenue and increasing their market share. They are all justifiable objectives, and obviously dependent on the objective that a business has set for itself will then drive a lot of its activity, and as we'll see as we go through this part of the presentation. Also, you're going to need to understand this principle of divorcing of ownership from control, and how that again might affect a firm's objectives, the conduct, and the performance. And in essence, that's another form of objective setting that is slightly different from some of the others that we're going to look at. So let's look at business objectives then. Now, obviously, you've done a little bit of research previously in terms of coming up with different forms of business objective, and there's some fairly obvious ones, but there are a few others that we might want to consider too. So, reasons for different objectives and some of the reasons for them, what we're going to look at. So, profit maximisation is probably the most popular one, and that's essentially, as it says, attempting to profit maximise. So, you're trying to produce at the lowest possible cost and sell at the highest possible figure that you can get away with, that the market will allow you to sell at. And obviously, if you can have the biggest gap between your costs and your revenue, that's going to provide the profit maximisation point. Okay. There are on occasions businesses will actually have revenue maximisation as their overall objective. So that's essentially where they're generating more sales volume and effectively not so much volume, but certainly when you think about how we calculate revenue, it's basically selling price times by quantity sold. So in this instance, if you're revenue maximising, you're trying to sell as much as you can for as much as you can. Sales maximisation, you would think, well, revenue maximisation and sales maximisation are the same, but they're not actually, because revenue maximisation is where you're generating revenue, i.e. selling price times the volume that you sell, the number of units that you can sell, whereas sales maximisation is concentrating not so much on the selling price that you can achieve, but actually how many units of your product or service that you're actually able to sell. So that becomes a maximisation of the number of sales that you're achieving, and that could well link to a market share objective too, as we'll see. There's also a satisficing objective. Now, these are the key four ones that you will need to understand and be able to demonstrate. And satisficing is essentially where businesses choose to they don't choose to profit maximise. They don't choose to maximise on anything. They sort of sit somewhere in the middle where they're quite comfortable and they're not doing exactly as well as they could, but they're quite comfortable. And this, in some cases, is where we have this divorce between the owners of a business and the managers of a business, and they might have slightly different objectives in terms of how they might go about their work, rather than being driven by the thing that the owner has as his or her main objective. And that's something again that we'll look at in a little bit more detail as we go through these slides. So the thing to bear in mind is that each of these different scenarios of profit maximisation, revenue maximisation, sales maximisation, and satisficing have diagrams to go with them. They are all reasonably similar in that they're demonstrating the same sort of thing, but obviously something slightly different in each instance. And obviously, in order to do that, we need to demonstrate an understanding of what each objective is and how we might demonstrate that in forms of a diagram, and also some formula that we might need to apply. So there's definitely a diagram and a formula for profit maximisation. There is definitely again some formulas and also diagrams for revenue maximisation. We'll look at sales maximisation as well, as those are the key three examples, and I've gone one too quickly there, but we'll just pop that one back a minute. Okay, so now in your books, now we're looking at page 7 onwards. So we've looked at the objectives of firms. We've well, briefly in terms of the overall content that you're going to need to cover, but also we're going to look at in a little bit more detail these principles of the different types of business objective that we're going to cover. Okay, so if we take a look on page 7 and then also we can flick through and see that we're going to look at stakeholders on page 8, 9 and 10. And then we're going to start to move into looking at the different types of business objectives and how we might actually demonstrate how they're presented in a graphic form. So I think, given the nature of the work required, certainly from pages 13 onwards, 13, 14 and 15 and 16, there's quite a few graphs that you need to draw, and that you'll need to stop the presentation and take a look at the way that the graphs have been drawn, and obviously you'll need to make sure that yours are accurately drawn in your book too. The one thing I would also do probably, guys, is to check the PAL 4th edition, where you've got the examples of these graphs drawn in. So if you've got that handy, that's obviously going to be a help too. Okay, so let's take a look then at the first example then. So this is where we're talking about profit maximization, and we will spend a little bit of time on this because you will see that it will keep coming up again and again and again and again in economics, because more often than not, this is the one type of objective that it is always assumed by economists that firms are attempting to achieve. Okay, now fundamentally we've looked at this in CC4 in a bit of detail already, and if we just we'll come back and take a look at the graph itself in a minute and the way that's presented, because this is a simplistic view in the first instance, and we're going to need to look at how profit maximization might occur in different types of market structures. So there's going to be a little bit of toing and froing between CC4 and CC5 in terms of trying to demonstrate that the understanding of the issues around cost and revenue, but also how profit maximization might be achieved in these different forms of market structure. Okay, so let's take a look then. Traditional view in economics, as we've mentioned, is that the firm is going to seek to maximize short-run profits. Okay, and effectively that will mean they will keep producing and will produce, keep producing until the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Okay, so remember, marginal cost is the cost of producing one extra unit, and marginal revenue is the revenue generated by that one extra unit. Okay, so if you think about that in a principle, then if you're thinking that for each of the extra units that you produce, for one extra unit that you produce, if your marginal revenue is higher than your marginal cost, so that means effectively your the revenue you're generating from that one extra item is higher than the marginal cost, then as a profit maximizer, you would keep on producing, because even if that's just a pound more, if you've got a pound more revenue than the marginal cost of your extra unit, then you'll keep producing until that point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Because even if you've got a very small slice of profit, it's still profit that you could make from each of those extra units that you're producing. Okay, there are some assumptions within this objective. Okay, now it does assume that owners control the management of the business, and it also assumes that there is sufficient and accurate knowledge on cost and revenue, so that effectively the business knows exactly what the marginal cost of each item is, and also what the marginal revenue generated also is. Okay, so there are some issues around how people can find that out. Now, clearly, if they've got good costing systems, then they might well be able to do that. But effectively, what we're going to do is to try and demonstrate how that works, and also to some degree explain and try to discuss whether we think these assumptions are realistic. Okay, now, in some cases, profit maximization as a principle is a great thing, I suppose, in that that's what lots of businesses want to try and achieve, to try and make the maximum amount of profit. But whether some of the assumptions are truly realistic, and whether we can actually know exactly where marginal cost and marginal revenue are absolutely at an equal point. But if we were going to try and demonstrate how we might go about this. Now, in this instance, this graph in particular, or this diagram in particular, to some degree, you should be able to guess what sort of a market that particular business is in. Okay. Now, in terms of market structure, now thinking about it, if we've got marginal revenue that's a horizontal line, what does that suggest? Does that suggest we're a price maker or a price taker? Well, clearly, in this instance, it must be we're a price taker in that marginal revenue is staying the same. It's not varying. We have no influence over the price that the market is going to give us for our particular cost, our particular product. So in this instance, we're looking at a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so marginal revenue is the horizontal line, but you can see that the point at which marginal cost and marginal revenue are equal. Now, our marginal cost line here is essentially, as we've said before, we start at the point where as we start to produce some more, one more item, then we have a slight dip in the cost due to fixed costs being spread over an extra unit, but also then we'll start to get to a point where marginal cost starts to increase as we have more costs to bear, essentially, in the production process. Now, at the point at which we have marginal revenue and marginal cost being equal, okay, that is the point at which we would be maximizing our profits. For all the time that marginal revenue is higher than our marginal cost, then each extra item that we're producing will actually produce us some extra profit. Okay. As soon as we get to the point where marginal cost is higher than marginal revenue, then at that point profits would rise if we actually reduced our output, because for every time that we produce something where our marginal cost is higher than our marginal revenue, we're actually making a small loss, aren't we, essentially, because it's costing us more to produce than we're selling it for. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. Now, here, if we then take a look at the way this particular diagram is annotated, we've got revenues and costs plotted against output, and in this instance we can see that at our price, our marginal revenue and our price being the same in a perfectly competitive market, the amount that we would produce would be Q1, okay, because that's the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and if we are a true profit maximizer, that is what we would do. Okay, so that's that explained. Hopefully we'll keep coming back to that, and obviously when we start to look at the point at which we're only really talking about marginal revenue and marginal cost in a perfectly competitive scenario here, in terms of market structure, we're going to have to look at a number of other examples too. Okay, so let's take a look then at the next point now, where if we take a look on page 8, and hope there are a few activities for you to do so that we can have a bit of a break from me talking too much at you. But one of the things that we need to understand is the fact that when we have a number of different stakeholders within a business, and a stakeholder is anybody who's basically got a vested interest in your business, and that could be that they're shareholders, or it could be that they're employees, or it could be that they're customers. So there's a whole range of different stakeholders that I'd like you to give some consideration to, and there's an article in your booklets on page 8, which look at different stakeholders and the fact that they tend to have different objectives. So it tells you a little bit about McDonald's, and there's a short article of about 4 or 5 paragraphs, and you should be able to pick out that there's a number of different stakeholders that each have slightly different views about the way in which McDonald's are operating, and also will have some sort of influence over both the activity and the performance or outcomes of a business. Okay, so I'd like you to have a read of that, and then you'll see that on page 9 there is a table that I'd also like you to have a go at completing. Okay, so first things first, have a read through the article, highlight the 6 key stakeholders that you can find there, list what you think some of their possible objectives might be, and also think about the ability they might have to control or influence decisions. Okay, now clearly there is a view that, and this is a particularly important view, and the way in which you can actually manage your stakeholders well, if you can manage your stakeholders well and identify who your key stakeholders are, and then also assess, number one, the level of interest that they might have, but also the level of power that they might have, an influence that they might choose to bring to bear in terms of the way in which your decisions might be taken. Okay, so that's a really important principle for any business, to make sure they understand, number one, who their key stakeholders are, making sure that they can keep those particular stakeholders happy, and also at times, sometimes there are going to be conflicts between the different types of stakeholder, and it's a case of trying to manage that whole process. Okay, so most important principle is to think about the level of power that and influence that those stakeholders might have, and also the level of interest. If you've got somebody who has a high level of interest and also a high level of power and influence, those are the guys that you've really got to stay on side with and make sure that you are taking them along with you, because if you don't, that can make it quite difficult to make sure that those people are not actually getting in the way of you achieving your overall business objectives. Okay, so that's going to take you a little while. I would say that it's probably going to take you 15-20 minutes to have a think about that, and inwardly digest, and then think about some possible objectives, and also the ability that those stakeholders might have to either control or influence decisions. Okay, so I'm going to leave you, and I suggest you turn the presentation off and have a go at filling in that table on page 9. Okay, thanks. So, if we then take a look at how you might have gone about this process, then, okay, and the different stakeholders and each ones that might have some sort of influence, I've listed now in some. This actually relates to McDonald's, but it could also relate to a whole raft of other businesses. And this isn't an exclusive list by any means, because there are a whole range of different types of stakeholder, dependent on the organisation and exactly the way in which the organisation is structured. Okay, but there are some classic examples here. So we've got an owner or a shareholder. Clearly, they would be a fairly fundamental stakeholder. Directors and managers within a business, employees clearly are going to be very important stakeholders. The government will be a stakeholder, because effectively, when you think about it, if a business is successful and it achieves higher levels of profit, then the government is going to benefit from that, because they will receive taxes on the profits that are achieved. Consumers, obviously, a very important group, because quite honestly, it doesn't matter how great all these other people might be. If you haven't got any consumers, you haven't got any customers, you haven't got a business. So they clearly are a very critical stakeholder, and making sure that you're satisfying their requirements is clearly a very important principle. Suppliers could be stakeholders, because if suppliers let you down, or they don't understand exactly what you're trying to achieve with your business, that can be a major problem for you. And clearly, we could have the local community too. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it just shows you that the range of different people and different organisations and pressure groups and all sorts of other organisations and groups that could have a significant effect on the decision making that you might take within a business. And you ignore those stakeholders at your peril, making sure you understand who they are, getting to know them well, getting to know them as closely as you can, to try and understand what is motivating them, and also how much information you're going to need to give them to keep them on side, and to make sure that is something that is not going to get in your way of achieving your overall business aims. So the classwork, obviously, that's I'll leave you to complete that table. And if you were really struggling in terms of highlighting some of the key stakeholders within the McDonald's case study, then they are listed there for you. Okay, so there are a number of different choices that you can take a look at, and again, think about what the possible objectives might be, and how much power will each of those groups have to influence decisions. Okay, let's take a look at some managerial theories then. So we talked about, to some degree, the fact that we've got a number of different stakeholders, but also we've got a situation where in some cases we have different levels of control, and in this case, this managerial theory, which is on page 10 in your booklets, does assume that the firm wishes to achieve and maximise managerial objectives rather than profit. Okay, so if you like, this is where we have this disconnect between ownership and control, and this leads into what the satisficing objective that we talked about previously. Okay, so if we've got the principals, who are the shareholders, okay, so they are the principal individuals that own the business, that don't run it necessarily. They certainly own the business. Okay, now to some degree, those shareholders and the principals will have certain control mechanisms that they can use, like, for instance, the pressure from the stock market. So if the share price starts to fall, then clearly shareholders are going to be pretty angry, and they might become quite an important pressure group, or quite an important stakeholder, to make sure that you understand exactly, they understand exactly what's going on, and that you understand as shareholders that the business is being managed in the correct fashion. Okay, now in this instance, certain shareholders effectively have these control mechanisms, as I mentioned, but then their agents are the board of directors for the company, and also the senior management. So they are essentially those that will control the day-to-day workings of the business. Now, to some degree, with regular meetings with shareholders like the AGM, and also performance-related pay, then to some degree the shareholders can vote and can influence how the board of directors and the senior management might control the business. And sometimes there is going to be a disconnect between those two. Where you get a divorce between ownership and control, then that clearly is a bit of an issue. So if we have shareholders or owners that are maybe in a public limited company, a PLC, they can't actually exercise day-to-day control over the decisions of the managers. And the managers may have slightly different objectives to the owners, i.e., you might have a sales director who thinks he wants to get as much commission as possible, and so might choose to go for a sales maximisation objective rather than profit maximisation. And that might mean that he'll get a big fat bonus, and he'll get a bigger desk and a smarter company car and all those sorts of things. So it might also be that those people, those individuals, are trying to help their own career and build a career resume to be able to move on to the next challenge, essentially. Okay, so in some cases we might find that some management decisions taken by the board of directors and the senior management within an organization may not necessarily be one to choose to maximize profits or shareholder value, as far as that's concerned, because effectively shareholder value is all about two things. One is about receiving a dividend from the shares that you hold based on the profits that the organization achieves, and the second thing is for the share price that the shareholders own to go up. Now, clearly, again, that is going to depend on the profitability and the success of the business. So clearly, you can see that there could be this potential disconnect. And as soon as you get this disconnect, there is an issue that needs to be addressed. Okay, so as we've said, in most cases, the view is that we want to maximise profit within an organisation. An owner is likely to want to do that, but where we get management running the business, controlling the business, in some cases we might choose to maximise our managerial objectives rather than profit, and that basically occurs for those reasons. Okay, so managers want having different objectives to owners, and in some cases they're not necessarily going to match up, and clearly there's going to be some conflict that will occur as a result of that, and it's then a case of managing that conflict or agreeing what the overall objective will be for the business, and agreeing that between shareholders and managers, and then setting a course to achieve those objectives. Okay, so the same sort of principle occurs where we've got this conflict going on. Okay, and effectively, as soon as we have principals and agents involved who are making decisions on the owner's behalf, we're going to get this, and this is a term that you'll remember from some of the behavioural economics that we looked at earlier on in the course. There could be this situation where there's asymmetric information. So in this case, the managers of the business might have more information available to themselves that they're not necessarily sharing with the principals because in this instance, maybe they want to protect their own turf, and as a result of that, that can cause all sorts of issues. So that clearly can be a bit of an issue. And in this scenario, you would think that what do you think? Which stakeholder might have more information about what's happening in the business, the shareholder or the manager? Well, I would think in most instances, in terms of day-to-day running, the manager is probably going to be more aware, and as a result of that, they might actually be withholding information from the shareholders because it doesn't necessarily suit their purpose. Okay. So if we then take a look at some of the other things that we've looked at previously, which obviously will help hopefully to understand this in a bit more detail, we've obviously got behavioural and organisational theories to think about too. Okay, so organisational theory and any sort of management theory basically assumes that a firm is a coalition of different groups like shareholders, managers and workers. And clearly, as soon as you get different groups that have maybe slightly different agendas, that is clearly then going to influence to some degree the objectives that maybe each group sets for itself, and also however much influence they have to set the course for the organisation, that may well then cause the organisational objectives to change. Now, we've looked at behavioural economics earlier on in the course, and that's to do with human behaviour and decision making, and to some degree integrates economics with psychology. And it was first pioneered by an American economist, a chap called Herbert Simon. Okay, now in this situation, what we're suggesting is that behavioural economists will look at the decisions that are made in complex organisations, and also there will be a range of different stakeholders who have got different objectives. And clearly, in that case, that is going to lead to conflict. And also, the view is that the dominant group at any moment in time can have a greater emphasis and give a greater emphasis to their own objectives. And so what we need to think about is who holds the relative power within that each group. Okay, now that can be any number of different people, and that can change over time, but clearly those people that have within the time frame that you're actually considering the overall objectives for the business, and also if you've got a relatively high level of power, you can then probably influence that, and then the overall objective becomes one that you have actually influenced, and that sets the course for the business for a period of time. So one of the things that we talked about briefly, and this sort of tees it up quite nicely, having gone through some of that principle of stakeholder, the different stakeholders that we have within an organisation, is that we've got another objective that we mentioned at the outset, which is something called satisficing. Okay, and effectively it's a combination of two words, satisficing and suffice. When you suffice, oh, that'll do, that's all right, that'll be sufficient. You're not necessarily going to be profit maximizing in that scenario. So if we're actually profit satisficing, we're making sufficient profit to satisfy the demands of shareholders. And in that situation, they clearly, we must satisfy that shareholders are happy to avoid any takeover or bankruptcy or shareholders revolt. But once we've achieved satisfactory profits to achieve that, the managers can pretty much choose to go about how they maximize their own rewards from the company. So if the shareholders are appeased, then one could argue that if we're in a profit satisficing culture, then the different organization or different departments within the organization and different directors or managers within the organization might choose to allocate resources slightly differently and possibly in their favor. Okay, now clearly that makes it a very complex scenario. Okay, so we get decision making where you've got managers who seek to achieve satisfactory profit rather than maximizing profit. And one could argue that how do they get away with that? Well, in some cases, if again the key people that hold the power are able to satisfy those people that are demanding that they achieve a certain level of profit by achieving that at a certain level, they can then choose to satisfy for the rest of the organisation, and that might then serve their own particular purpose much better. So that's essentially where, and this can happen in a number of different areas. Okay, one is where there is a significant amount of market power. So if an organisation is holding a high level of market share and maybe is able to set their own prices because they can provide a differentiated service or product to the rest of the market, that clearly can have a significant influence and where some profit satisficing will come from. Definitely the divorce between ownership and control, like we've described in the previous slides, that will also be could cause profit satisficing to go on, and also where we have low levels of contestability within a market. Now, we haven't really looked at contestability, but that's the principle of if you can make a market more contestable, that means that competition are able to come into that market and essentially compete with you. If you've got high barriers to entry within a market, or you've got organizations that have significant market power, then it becomes more difficult for markets to become contestable. Okay, so those are things that we'll look at later on in the course. Certainly contestability and how and the sort of criteria and characteristics that markets have to have for them to be contestable or non-contestable, and that's something that we'll look at, as I mentioned, in a bit more detail later on. Now, to some degree, we might also find that profit satisficing could be used to avoid the attention of any regulatory authorities. So, for instance, if we are in a strong market position and we can profit maximize, the argument could be that if we're making profits that are too high, the government regulator or the Competition and Markets Authority might come in and think, hold on a minute, why is this organisation making so much profit? And it may well be that they look at that and then think that maybe the business is exploiting its monopoly power. And in that scenario, they could then start to put regulations in place to stop that from happening. So to some degree, businesses might choose to just go and fly under the radar slightly, so not make super duper, super normal profits, but they will actually just make enough so that they're not actually being they're not being flagged up to the authorities to suggest that maybe they're making too much money. Okay, let's take a look then at the other sales objectives, or the different types of objective that we might have. So we talked a little bit about satisficing. We're going to talk about sales revenue maximization next, and this is again showing you the so if you start looking at page 11 onwards, I think it's from 11 onwards. Let me just check for you. That's talking about satisficing, and there's a couple of questions on page 11 and 12 that you might want to have a go at answering too. There are a couple of multi-choice questions for you to have a look at. But what we're going to start to look at from here is pages 13, 14, 15, and 16, where we've got some diagrams, some graphs drawn out for you that you can actually fill in for each of the different types of objective that business might set for itself. Okay, so if we're talking about sales revenue maximization, then here we basically got a situation where what we would choose to do is to maximize the total amount of revenue that we can achieve rather than anything else. So we would keep producing until our marginal revenue reaches Q2. Okay, so that's the point at which we can carry on till, and effectively there's a number of reasons for this, as it's included there in the information that's included both in your booklet and also so that's the booklet on page 14, top of page 14. So basically what we're trying to do is maximize the sales, so the number of units that have been sold. Okay, so in that scenario we're talking about volume and the or output maximization. We're trying to produce and sell as many items as we're able to. Okay, So in this scenario, that might well happen because maybe managerial pay, particularly the sales director and the sales managers, may be linked to the revenue rather than the profit of the business. Now, one could argue that would be a mistake on the part of the owners or the controlling influences within the business, because in this instance that's quite a different concept. So profit maximization is one thing, revenue maximization is another. Okay, so if we take a look at the profit maximization that we talked about before, that's the point at which total revenue and total cost are the gap between those two is at its greatest. Okay, and clearly, as we proved to ourselves earlier on in the course, and also in the previous couple of slides, the point at which, if we're profit maximizing, we will keep producing to the level of output at which marginal revenue actually equals marginal cost. Okay, now if we take revenue maximization as the example, we will actually carry on producing until to a level of output at which the marginal revenue is zero. Okay, so we will carry on if revenue maximization is the key objective. We'll carry on until where the marginal revenue we're achieving is zero. Okay, so the point at which we're not producing any more revenue at all. Okay, now clearly there's a significant difference between profit maximization and revenue maximization, and that's shown in 5.3 in this diagram here. Okay, so if we take a look at what we're showing here, the profit maximizing level of output at Q1, okay, is the point at which our marginal cost and our marginal revenue is that's the point at which we would sell. Okay, now clearly in this situation you can see that if we're producing at that level of output and we are achieving at P1, clearly there is a significant difference between our cost and the actual revenue that we're achieving. Okay, and clearly that is showing that we are profit maximizing. So there's a big difference between our although marginal cost and marginal revenue is demonstrating that, oops, sorry, I've gone one too far, is showing us that's that scenario there, that in this case, where we're actually carrying on producing over and above and past that, we're actually carrying on producing and to the output at which a level at which we're then not going to achieve any further sales. Okay. So in that scenario then, if we've got average revenue and marginal revenue curves that slope downward and to the right, the profit maximizing level of output is always going to be below the revenue maximizing level of output, because we will carry on producing past that point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, because we believe that we can still make a little bit more sales revenue, and that's the reason for that whole principle. Okay, so again, I'm going to leave you some time to I'd stop the presentation and then draw in that diagram within your sales maximization box on page 14. Okay, so let's then take a look at this in a bit more detail. So we talked about, in that case, sales maximization. We're talking about volume. Okay, in this instance, though, we're talking about revenue maximization. Okay, now that is a slightly different scenario. Okay, so in this situation, we're talking about it was a theory that Baumol came up with in 1959, and it was the principle that manager-controlled firms would try to maximize sales revenue, because the larger the size of a firm, the more likely it is that pay and fringe benefits and for senior managers is going to go up as a result. Okay, so in that scenario, basically, we would achieve sales revenue maximization at a point where we've got marginal revenue equaling zero. In this situation, then output is going to be higher than the profit maximizing output, as we mentioned. But the exact level of output is going to depend on the degree of accountability of agents, like managers or to the principals. And in some situations, we might find there's a compromise between revenue maximization and profit maximization. That's basically where we're talking about revenue maximization. Okay, now if we're talking about, in this case, output maximization, that's again a slightly different scenario. So in this case, what we've got is a situation where we've got we're trying to maximize the number of units sold. Okay, so in this case, the manager will be focusing on the volume of sales, and therefore the output is going to be even higher. Okay, so the output essentially is going to be increased to the point at which our break-even point is achieved, where we're just achieving normal profit. And as with revenue maximization, that could occur within a manager-controlled business to a much larger degree, where again they've got more incentive because they're going to get higher pay, etc. Okay, it can also be used where we're looking to try to generate higher levels of market share, or to drive out a rival from a market, and also possibly to maximize long-run profit, because this could be what's known as a limit pricing strategy. So effectively what we're saying is we want to sell as many units, get the maybe a strong market position, maybe even a market leading share of the market, and in that situation the way in which we would demonstrate that graphically would be as follows. Okay, so this is where we're talking about output maximization. Okay, so in this situation then let's just take a look at how that works. We've got a scenario in this case where we're using the situation where we're effectively charging at P3, where our average cost and our average revenue are the same. Okay, so at that point there, okay, the point at which average cost and average revenue is the point at which we would keep producing. Okay, so you can see in this scenario we have gone way past the production level for marginal cost and marginal revenue, and we've gone to the point at which we're achieving normal profits at break-even point, where effectively in this case our average cost and our average revenue are the same. So we would produce at Q3. So you can see that where we look at our marginal revenue and our sales maximization, revenue maximization, where we actually keep producing until we produce no more revenue. In this scenario, where we're talking about the units produced or units sold, we've got an even more significant level of output that we would be willing to produce at if we were output maximizing. Okay, so effectively in this case we were maximizing sales based on volume rather than value. Okay, so the previous example was about value. Okay, so essentially number of units sold times by revenue. In this case, we're not really too concerned about what did I say then? I said, sorry, so I meant selling price times by units sold. And in this scenario, what we're doing is, we're not concerned so much about selling price. In this case, we're about producing the largest number of units sold, essentially. Okay, slightly difficult distinction in that you sometimes might think, well, why are you differentiating between the two? But hopefully you can see in this situation where we're talking about output maximization, we have again a different scenario again. Okay, so this is the last slide that we're going to take a look at, and this basically is showing a combination of all of those things on one chart. And you might think, crikey, that's a bit complicated. But if you take a look on page 15, it's basically summarizing those 4 objectives profit maximisation, revenue maximisation, and sales maximisation included within. But also, it's also showing the point at which we might be choosing to profit satisfice as well. Okay, so if we take a look at the curves that we've got on here, we've got our total cost curve here. Okay, so total cost curve, we've got a total revenue curve here. We then got maximum minimum profit targets, and also we got the total profit showing all on one stylized diagram. Okay, so if we take a look at our profit maximizing output, well, profit maximization is about where, the difference, the size of the gap between our total revenue and total cost is at its most significant. Okay, so you can see in this instance that would be at Q2. Oops. Because as you can see, profit maximization, the gap between our total cost line and our total revenue line is at its greatest. Okay, so profit maximizing output would be at Q2. Revenue maximizing output would be the point at which our revenue is at its highest point. Okay, and then you can see that we're still making a profit, a significant profit, but we're not profit maximizing as such. So this would be at Q1. Okay, so revenue maximizing output would be Q1. If we then look at profit satisficing, where shareholders insist on a minimum profit as indicated, so the minimum profit here is the point at which we would produce. Okay, so that satisfies our shareholders, but it also means that we can actually use some of that other profit that we might be able to achieve to put into our own bonuses, etc. Okay, and then if we take a look at the sales maximizing output, where we're talking in this instance, showing that that's the point at which the firm starts to make a loss. Okay, so the point, that basic point would be at Q3 there. Okay, so effectively, as soon as we start to make a loss, that's the point at which sales maximizing output would stop. Okay, so that sort of summarizes that so far. I feel as I might have gone through that slightly too quickly, but what we will do is we'll revisit that when we come to look at the next time that we have a chat together. Now, that will be tomorrow, but that's more to do with the work that we've done previously, and then I would suggest that having had a chance to look at this during the second lesson that you have tomorrow morning, then we can have a further discussion after half term to make sure that you've got a clear view as to how you might demonstrate all of this information and be able to graphically represent it. And that will take a little bit of practice, and also once you start to get to understand it, it's pretty straightforward, to be honest. It's just in a case of remembering it. But we'll have a catch up on that after half term. Okay, so thanks for listening, guys. I'm sorry if I got a little bit went a little bit too quick on that, but we can always come back and revisit it should we need to.